Welcome back for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings podcast, brought to you through the support of Booz Allen. Accelerate today's missions with tomorrow's technologies. As the leader in providing AI solutions to the federal government and one of the world's largest cybersecurity providers, Booz Allen advances game-changing capabilities rapidly, ethically, and securely. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. Well, I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine, and I'm pleased to have a guest return with us today to talk about a very dynamic article in the current December issue of Naval History that's drawing a lot of great feedback. It harkens to 50 years ago, at a time when the Navy, like the nation itself, was going through some real upheavals and disruptions in the 1970s. The Vietnam War was winding down. Social unrest and racial strife were racking the nation. And these things spilled over into the fleet, a fleet tired from nearly a decade of fighting in Vietnam and needing to rebuild and to adjust to the future of the country and the Navy as well. And from that, there emerged two very dynamic CNOs in the 1970s Navy. One of them, very familiar to everybody, Admiral Zumwalt. His successor, Admiral James Holloway, was equally dynamic. And in fact, as the article is titled, provides a study in contrast. And here to talk about Admirals Zumwalt and Holloway at the helm of the U.S. Navy in the 1970s is our good friend, Edward Marolda. Ed, welcome back.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be with you and your audience.
Yes. Well, we're glad to have you. And this is a topic of you're particularly an authority on this. You've written a book on it, quite renowned, of recent note. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is such a fascinating period of the Navy to read about now for me. I mean, the 70s has that patina of history on it more than it used to somehow. And it all, as it comes into light in that way, you start to see it with a perspective of time and realize how transitional a period that was. Like I say, the Navy is very analogous to the country at that point in terms of the things it's dealing with. And these two leaders of the Navy in that time faced some real challenges. So why don't you set the stage and tell us about Zumwalt and Holloway? They certainly, their lives had intersected all the way through to their point where they're at this moment of destiny in the 70s.
Well, Eric, you set the table very well. And true enough, what you're saying, the Navy was like the nation at the time, experiencing a bit of upheaval. People were tired of the war. Social unrest was in the country. We had racial divide, various other things that affected the populace and affected the Navy as well. The piece I wrote, in the title, I think, speaks to it all, a study in contrast. And I want to make the point that there are no villains in the piece. They were both professional naval officers who served their country to the best of their ability. They just took a different approach to leadership, specifically when they were chiefs of naval operations, how they went about that task. But as you alluded to, they had a similar background. They were both graduates of the class of 1943 at the U.S. Naval Academy. They stood out. Admiral Holloway was a known boxer. He won many competitions. And Admiral Zumwalt was a gifted speaker, as he always would be. And they also were together at the National War College in 1962. Their families, they were very close socially. Their families would often get together. Admiral Holloway's wife, Dabney, and Musa Zumwalt and families, they often got together. And so there was a social affinity. And also the Admiral Holloway, or Admiral Zumwalt, who was a bit ahead of Admiral Holloway, brought him on board as Vice Chief of Naval Operations, his second in command of the Navy, because he thought very highly of Admiral Holloway's operations in Vietnam. He had two tours on board the USS Enterprise, America's first nuclear-powered carrier. And then later on, 1972, he commanded the 7th Fleet during the very important end of the war operations, Linebackers 1 and 2, and the mining of the ports of North Vietnam. And during the time when Admiral Holloway was the vice chief, He really didn't he didn't want to stand out. He said, Admiral Zumwalt is the boss, and I'm going to try and carry out his agenda to the best of my ability. Even then, he had some differences of opinion, but he kept them to himself, basically. Only when he became Chief of Naval Operations, and Admiral Holloway, Admiral Zumwalt, by the way, endorsed Admiral Holloway to be the next CNO. So there was clearly an affinity for each other, and the good of the Navy was certainly on their radar scope. So I think that's the jump-off point to their different terms as Chief of Naval Operations. And it goes back to their style, their personalities, really. Admiral Zumwalt, of course, had been head of all U.S. naval forces in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970. He was the chief of the Naval Advisory Group Vietnam, 38,000 sailors under his command. And he was and he is, he's still beloved by those who served under him. He thought a lot about his sailors, their well-being. He was personally brave. He went out to the battlefield. They had to restrain him from going out to the battlefield too often. He went on a few patrols and they said, you're taking undue risk here. But he was always there to greet planes or helicopters coming into Saigon with wounded sailors. In one instance, he brought the fiancée of a naval officer who was terminally injured, wounded, brought his fiancée to Vietnam to be with him, knowing, of course, he would pass away. Things like that. He also was very innovative in his approach to things. He came up with a new strategy in Vietnam called Sea Lords. Now, it wasn't to win the war, but it was to take advantage of the enemy's being on the back foot after the Tet Offensive. We all think of the Tet Offensive as the turning point in the war, and it was in a strategic sense. Certainly, Lyndon Johnson and company thought that way. But it was also a tactical defeat for the communists, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese troops. Some 100,000 casualties. So Admiral Zumwalt came out with his Sea Lords campaign. In the short term anyway, there was a great deal of success in the Mekong Delta. He was very dependent when he was in Vietnam on a small staff, really, that he came up with all kinds of ideas. In fact, they call them Zumwalt's Wild Ideas, ZWIs. Many of those ideas did not pan out, but he was willing to try. So he's very innovative. He's very daring. As we all know, he has a standout personality. He later was on the magazine front cover of Time magazine. Bushy eyebrows. I think he even had a mullet at one point. Very media savvy. And in fact, when he was CNO, he had a video program was distributed to the fleet, showing him jogging and just being out there. And he visited the fleet often, was beloved by junior officers and enlisteds. Admiral Holloway, less out there, but he's definitely made an impact as well. He served in World War II. Both Zumwalt and Holloway served in World War II, earning medals for combat operations. Admiral Zumwalt had been off Guadalcanal at the Battle of Savo Island, 1942, and Admiral Holloway was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in Surigao Strait on board a destroyer, the Benyon. So they had their combat bona fides. Holloway went on to Korea. He changed his affiliation. He went from surface warfare to aviation, commanded a squadron in Korea, did very well in that position. They both went off to Washington, various staff positions, Pentagon positions, commanded ships and squadrons out in the fleet. And then they proceeded into their various Vietnam duties. And of course, Admiral Holloway was fleeted up in 1970 to be the Chief of Naval Operations, over the heads of 33 other flag officers who also wanted that job. That led to some discontent among those who were passed over, if you will. And they expressed their views. And one of the main points they made was that Admiral Zumwalt had never really commanded a numbered fleet like the 7th Fleet or an area fleet, the Pacific Fleet. And that they said he's not prepared for the top job. He doesn't know how to handle large organizations or how to handle large staffs. He relies on a small coterie of supporters, some of whom were willing to go along with the boss and really idolized him. They had stars in their eyes, I think. One example is when Admiral Zumwalt became Chief of Naval Operations in 1970, he immediately put out a plan, Project 60. In other words, it will be done in 60 days. And it's looking at, here's what I see for the future of the U.S. Navy. Well, he didn't assign that to the Chief of Naval Operations staff. He assigned it to a few officers, Stan Turner, very sharp individual, and sent him to work on that. And Stan Turner later admitted, wow, I was overwhelmed. This was a huge responsibility to come up with this document in 60 days. Well, he did. And Admiral Zumwalt then presented that to an assembled group of his top flag officers. And it was like, here's the plan. And they said, well, okay, well, we haven't really had a chance to look at it, but I guess this is your plan. Off we go. And that was his approach that I think differed from Jim Holloway's. Jim Holloway was more of a measured, let's look at all the sides, let's bring in everybody and get involved in this. One of the differences also was the approach to reaching those in the fleet. As soon as Admiral Zumwalt became Chief of Naval Operations, he put out Z-grams, Zumwalt Z-grams, 120 Z-grams that dealt with many aspects of sailors' life, quality of life issues in the fleet, and for racial equality, for how women would fit in the service, and various other topics. And he went out to the fleet. And the way he did it, though, is got him in trouble because he not bypassed, but he certainly went directly to the sailors with not much input from the chiefs in the fleet and the senior officers, commanding officers. And a lot of them didn't take kindly to that approach. Now, he had positive response, and a lot of these things were long overdue. The Navy had not well treated its African American and female and other minority sailors prior to this time. He wanted to change that, and he indeed did during his term as CNO. Admiral Holloway had many of the same aspirations, and he continued with a lot of the things that Admiral Zumwalt had begun. But he wanted a more measured pace to this. He looked at some of Zumwalt's programs and kept those that made sense. Others, he said, they make no sense. They were put into place too quickly without a lot of thought, and caused some backlash and some trouble. So that just speaks to their approaches to various things.
Yeah, I was intrigued by that about Zumwalt because he always sort of has that mystique about him as the people's admiral. He'd come down and talk to the sailors. You see him in the mess with them, and I'm sure that was razzle dazzle for the sailors to get that kind of treatment. But it's kind of a reverse end run, like going above your boss to the next boss. He's doing the opposite in the other way. Mm-hmm. Do you think he was kind of a little bit unaware of the reaction that is going to create in those who are sort of bypassed? Is he? I get a sense that he wasn't really conscious that he was generating that kind of bad vibe from those in between him and the sailors he's talking to. It's just like he just blindly went forward and did it and didn't think of the possible ramifications.
I think he was conscious of it, but he wasn't going to be deterred by it. Mm-hmm. One of the things he did was he said, we need to put more emphasis on the surface force. You've got the so-called unions in the Navy, the surface Navy, the aviation Navy, and the submarine Navy. And he said, for far too long, the aviators have had the high ground. We need to level the ground and give more attention to his branch, which was the surface Navy. And there's some justification for that. But a lot of the aviators took umbrage at that, as did some of the submariners. That didn't sit well with some. The others, I mentioned how he became Chief of Naval Operations, did not sit well with others. and his approach. Now, rather than getting the Office of the Chief of Naval OpNav involved in Project 60, for instance, or some of his other programs, he went to his usual small staff and focus groups. He brought in a lot of enlisted personnel and junior officers to sit on these focus groups and come up with their ideas. How do we improve the Navy? Well, those who were on the staff, the OpNav staff, said, well, what about us? We really haven't been consulted. So if people feel like they're on the outs, they're not willing to give their all in support of the boss. They may slow roll it, if you will. So I don't think that did him very well. A case in point, the Project 60, when it finally did come out, it generated opposition from the aviators, from some of the submariners, from congressmen who had districts that were not going to be helped. Well, let me go back. Project 60 basically came out. We need some revolutionary surface ships. We need a surface effect ship, which is in essence a small aircraft carrier, as opposed to nuclear-powered large deck carriers. And also he had surface effect ships. Okay, it's on a bubble of air across the ocean, hydrofoils. These are all like futuristic kinds of things. Now the frigates, the Oliver Hazard Perry frigates, eventually got to the fleet. But that was the only one of Project 60 of these major systems that got to the fleet. The others ran into opposition for one reason or another and did not make it. As I said, people who were, some of the congressmen who were from districts where they're building aircraft carriers didn't take kindly to not having continuation of the building of large carriers. Yeah. That was
good.
So he had not. He also. I want to go into his personality. He was very forward-looking. He was very, very innovative, but he didn't take kindly to opposition. It's not that his opposition, they were enemies, but he, like I said, he didn't take kindly to disagreements, and he just pushed on through. A couple of examples here. I remember a lot of the wives of prisoners of war in Vietnam, the League of American Families. Admiral Zumwalt went to meet with them on a Sunday morning, and they expressed to them how the government was not well serving their husbands in captivity. Well, Admiral Zumwalt got all fired up. He went over to the executive office building, barged into the office of Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor, and was basically reading him the riot act. Why isn't the administration doing this and that? So he came in unannounced on a Sunday morning. Not that he didn't have a good point to make, but the manner in which he did it did not serve him well. Another thing he said, Admiral Hyman Rickover, okay, the father of nuclear strategy, or the nuclear navy, if you will, beloved and admired by many Americans, many in the Navy, many in Congress. Admiral Zumwalt says, we have to rein him in. It's time for him to retire. And so he had a very public dispute in front of Congress that Rickover should go. Well, it didn't happen. He realized, he admitted later that was a mistake. I shouldn't have taken on Rickover because he had so much support in Congress and in the Navy. And of course, Admiral Rickover went on to serve until 1982. So he continued to have the support of the Navy and Congress. Another personality quirk I think got him in trouble was with Henry Kissinger, and not just over the issue of the POWs, but all manner of things of dealing with foreign policy, military policy, and the rest of it. Of greater importance was his interaction, Admiral Zumwalt's interaction with President Nixon. Nixon was not enamored with Zumwalt's support for social reform in the Navy. President Nixon had served in the Navy, and he said, what are you doing to my Navy? In 1972, there were racial and other disturbances on the ships, Constellation, Euler Hassayampa, and Kitty Hawk, aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk. And Nixon did not like the way Zumwalt handled, in particular, the Constellation episode. So that didn't set right with him. The fact that he was chief of naval operations, Admiral Zumwalt, you would think he would be involved in Vietnam strategy. Well, Admiral Zumwalt, like the other members of the Joint Chiefs, really were not part of developing Vietnam strategy. They had been, even back in the Johnson days, their advice had not been readily taken by the commander-in-chief. Well, that happened in spades during the Nixon administration. President Nixon did not like Admiral Zumwalt. He did not like Creighton Abrams, who had come back from Vietnam and was in some disfavor. And even his predecessor, General Westmoreland, who was on the Joint Chiefs at one point. Nixon didn't like him. And the only one Nixon really liked was Admiral Thomas H. Moore, okay, Chief of Naval Operations 67 to 70, and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And Nixon went to Moore almost all the time, not exclusively, but almost exclusively for his military advice. He ignored whatever was coming out of the Joint Chiefs. So you would think Zumwalt coming back from Vietnam would have had a big say. He was on the spot over there. He really didn't have an in with the White House on Vietnam strategy. It was Nixon, Kissinger, and Moore. So so his personality again got
right.
him out of control.
Well, it's clearly an outsized kind of personality, and I wonder if that's part of his rancorousness towards another outsized personality. Large personalities often don't get along with each other, and I wonder if that's part of the root of his animosity towards Rickover. I know he also thought he had a little too much power. He's at the Nuclear Commission as well as his military role, et cetera, but he just seemed to he was like his white whale to some degree, to almost more of a degree than it makes sense. Why would he bother to?
There's a little history there. You know, Admiral Rickover had this famous interview process where people wanting to get into the nuclear power program would come into Rickover's office. He had a chair specifically built where two of the legs were lower than the other. So automatically the interviewee is off balance, if you will, literally and figuratively. And so Admiral Zumwalt went through that process. Very grueling. In the meantime, he came out because they always had a break in between. Zumwalt came out. He was rattled. He talked, I forget, to the other officer who was there to keep him calm and said, "Oh, don't worry about that. This is his standard operating procedure. Don't worry about it too much." But it did rattle Zumwalt. He never forgot that.
Okay.
And so it began there. Now, Rickover actually asked him, "I want you to be part of the nuclear power program." Zumwalt said, "No, I don't want to do it." So it started back then. But it was just the fact that you had another shining light, taking away for his light. And so they did not get along well. Just the opposite. And I want to talk about Holloway, because Holloway, I don't want to say always did the right thing. He made mistakes too. I mean, they're both human. And as I said, there's no villains in the piece. They both served their country as best they could. And they had many accomplishments and many attributes. Holloway, he went out, he commanded Enterprise, 2 combat tours off Vietnam, did very well in that job, in charge of the 7th Fleet during the linebacker campaigns, which really were instrumental in getting the enemy to realize, okay, we've gotten enough of what we wanted, let's settle. We had the Paris Agreement on the 27th of January, 1973. And as I mentioned, Admiral Holloway served as vice chief under Zumwalt. They got along well during that time period. But when he came in as chief of naval operations, Admiral Zumwalt said, number one, I want to not streamline, but take some of the bumps out of the social revolution process. And he began to go back. For instance, there was a lot of complaint by a congressional committee looking into the aircraft carrier disturbances, the Constellation. And they said, well, one of the problems is that they thought discipline had been taking a back seat in the Navy during Zumwalt's time in office. Holloway kind of agreed with that. He said, yeah, there's some things that Admiral Zumwalt wanted to return fun and zest to the fleet. And Holloway said, no, the Navy's there to fight and win wars, not necessarily have fun and zest. That's a secondary thing. Another thing was Admiral Zumwalt really valued youth over experience. Okay, so he created what was called the Mod Squad from a TV program of the period of young folks going out there conquering crime. Well, this squadron was a destroyer squadron. It's made up of officers at all levels, one level below what they normally would be. In other words, young people rather than experienced. When Holloway came in, he said, well, that's great, but I value experience more than youth. So he pretty much walked that back. The other thing about discipline, Admiral Holloway, and I remember this because working at the Washington Navy Yard, we used to go to the Chiefs Club during lunch and have beer and whatnot, and they had dancing ladies and things of that sort. Holloway said, enough of that in my Navy. He said, too many sailors are coming back from lunch half in the bag. The discipline wasn't there. So he closed clubs during the workday. Just one example of some of the different approaches he was taking. Another, Admiral Zumwalt was very big on different uniforms for the Navy. He wanted to get away from the old crackerjack uniform. And the uniforms, according to the critics, didn't differentiate between chiefs and sailors. And the old-timers, the lifers, didn't really care for that. But so when Admiral Holloway came in, he said, okay, I hear what the traditionalists are saying, and I agree with them. We need to keep some of the crackerjack uniforms, some of the other uniforms, because they go back in Navy history. They're very important. But I'm not going to do it right away. Okay, Admiral Zumwalt put a lot of money into the uniform changes. We're going to do it in an evolutionary process, but eventually we'll get back to the uniforms we want. And that was, like I say, that was his approach. Another issue was the rise of the Soviet Navy threat was very big during the Vietnam War. While we're fighting the war in Vietnam, the Soviet Navy is going global. You had major global exercises in 1970, then 1975. And so Admiral Zumwalt was very much concerned about this. So he went before Congress and he said, the house is falling. If we get into a war with the Soviets, a conventional war, we will lose. And he would give percentages, and every year it got worse and worse. Admiral Holloway came in, he said, well, let's not get too carried away here. There is a Soviet Navy threat. We need to be conscious of it, but let's not go overboard. We still have the most powerful fleet in the world, and we can deal with it. And this also goes to the approach. Both Admiral Zumwalt and Admiral Moore, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, pretty much had the same view about the rise of the Soviet threat. But Admiral Moore dealt with it by going personally to Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon and saying, we need to do this to help the Navy to build up because of this threat. So it was a very private approach as opposed to Zumwalt's very public approach, going in front of Congress, the sky's falling, we're going to get killed. It didn't sit well with people in the Navy and people in Congress. Just more examples of their differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's easy. I can see it'll be easy for his detractors to see him as a glory grabber, and as you point out, he was sort of labeled a political admiral, being appointed over the heads of the others and whatnot. But in the popular memory, he's remembered as sort of the reformer that brought racial reforms, helping blacks and women get ahead further in the Navy. But I was really interested to read how, if you really look at the record, Holloway also was working on that, and it was actually more effective in long-term results. Because Zumwalt is often kind of, if he's remembered just briefly off the top of someone's head, they think of him in that kind of way. He really didn't move the ball that far, though, did he, in the final analysis?
Well, he changed the whole dynamic in the Navy. From that point on, the Navy really did pay much more attention to improving the quality of life of sailors, but also advancement for African Americans, women, and other minorities. There's no question he was a key turning point in that whole dynamic. But Holloway, as I mentioned, he carried it forward. He had his own affirmative action plan, and he also worked to get women into ships other than hospital ships. But they were both they had a problem because the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass. Zumwalt had counted on that to help get more women into the service, into various billets. And the combat exclusion law continued to exclude women from combat, being close to combat. And so they both had to deal with that. But Holloway, but a lot of things that Zumwalt gets credit for sometimes is exaggerated, like his support for women in the Navy. If you look at the Z-grams, there are 120 Z-grams that he sent out to the fleet. The one that deals with discrimination against women or helping them advance in the service was number 116, I believe. So he didn't get that for a while in his term in office. Another thing that always struck me, the other armed services each had hundreds of women that served in Vietnam, other than nurses. They were in all capacities, support capacities in Vietnam. The Navy only allowed 2 female officers at any one time to be in country. That was a total of 8 women. And it was only one in particular, Elizabeth Wiley, was the daughter of Admiral J.C. Wiley, very important strategist in the Navy. And she said, she just complained a lot and said, look, I want to serve my country in Vietnam, but I'm not allowed to go. She finally got to go. But 8 total, I mean, that's a very small number. And Admiral Zumwalt ran afoul of the women who were in charge of Navy women. At one point, I've forgotten her name at this point, but she said she got a position out on the West Coast only because she couldn't get along with Zumwalt. He wanted focus groups to deal with the issues of women in the Navy, and this admiral said, no, I don't think that. She was very conservative, and that was not unusual. And she said women didn't buy into the Navy to go fight in combat. Well, maybe she didn't, but there were others who wanted to take risks with the men. So he gets credit, and he deserves credit for starting the ball rolling, but it wasn't a smooth operation.
Yeah. Now the uniforms of the Zumwalt era Navy. Let's talk about those, because when I picture the early '70s Navy, it is quite a. It looks like a holdover from the late '60s. It's now entered into the fleet. You see beards, I believe. Beards become
Right.
okay. Longer hair.
Right.
It's just a whole radical look change. I can see how traditionalists at the time probably were just in freak out mode over this.
You're right. Yeah.
So it sounds like coming back down from that ledge was done in stages by Holloway in his usual thoughtful, deliberative manner.
Mm-hmm.
But what were some of the more radical uniform loosening up of restrictions and whatnot that Zumwalt?
Well, I'm not really into the ins and outs of the uniform changes. As I mentioned, I think chiefs' uniforms really approximated what enlisted were going to be wearing, and so they didn't like that. I don't even think the enlisted liked it. In fact, studies done afterwards showed that sailors really liked their crackerjack uniform. It was distinctive. It was U.S. Navy sailor, and so it wasn't just the chiefs who were not in favor of that change in uniform approach.
Yeah, I've never understood why he was so against that. There's a famous recruitment poster for the Navy, I guess from the JFK era. It's a painting of a sailor, and he just, I can see kids look at this, oh, I want to be that guy, It's
Right.
Yeah. So, but he, for some reason, I guess he thought it was antiquated or whatever. But it sounds like a lot of what he had, his heart was in the right place, and he had good instincts, but he maybe kind of shot from the hip with ideas and you see the origins of it in the Vietnam period, where he's got, as you put it, Zumwalt's wild ideas. It's good to spitball like that, which he obviously was really, popping one idea after another, but you do that to see which ones have some legs and which ones don't. It sounds like he would just he would put the idea out and then become dogged about it before thinking it all the way through.
Well, here's one example of that in Vietnam. Someone came up with the idea that we want to improve the caloric intake of the South Vietnamese sailors. So there's this island near Da Nang. It's called Cu Lao Ray. Nobody lives there, but he said, why don't we put a whole bunch of goats on Cu Lao Ray? And of course, they'll proliferate. And then the sailors can go ashore, shoot a goat, and have something to eat. Well, they came back after, so they actually experimented with it. So, no, that didn't work out. The goats took off into the jungle. You never saw them again. I mean, it didn't pan out. I always thought that was maybe indicative of some of the other ideas worked. I mean, he was very good at recognizing good tactics, if you will. Mm-hmm. At one point earlier in the war, our river patrol boats, PBRs, would go up and down the main rivers and search out the enemy. They'd even, like at night, be running up the river. Well, those boats made a lot of noise. So they took a new approach, which was called the waterborne guard post, where two PBRs would tie up next to the bank just after dusk. The lights going down so the enemy can't see them very well. Pull into the side of the river bank underneath foliage if you got it, and be quiet. Turn off your engines and wait. And sure, but they would be by likely enemy crossing points, and they'd wait there all night. Half the time, nothing would happen, but the other half of the time, here comes the Viet Cong across the river. Of course, they would open up and do their thing. He recognized that as a great strategic approach or tactical approach. The other thing was in Sea Lords. He said, well, rather than running up and down the rivers to keep stuff coming in from Cambodia, supplies for the enemy, why don't we just put our boats horizontally across the border? So they have to come through our patrols directly to get into the Mekong Delta. Again, had really put a stopper on a lot of the enemy's supplies coming in. But I want to get on to Admiral Holloway and his term. And he's been credited with, well, he didn't like Admiral Zumwalt's approach to national strategy. When Admiral Zumwalt became Chief of Naval Operations, he said, all right, we've put too much attention on projection of power ashore, ergo carriers and ships bombarding ashore. We need to have more attention to sea control, controlling the oceans, because the Soviets are vying for control of the ocean. Put a lot of emphasis on sea control. Holloway came in and he said, well, sea control to me is that you're talking about protecting the sea lanes to Europe to support NATO. So what, the U.S. Navy is going to be an escort force, just escorting ships back and forth? What about the Navy's historically global mission? We have responsibilities all over the world. And sometimes we need to project power ashore, as we did in Vietnam, but we need to be able to do it elsewhere. So Holloway put more attention back on the presence of our forces around the globe, and also to projection of power. One example, President Carter had what was called the swing strategy. And in very simple terms, what it meant was, if we go to war with the Soviets, I'm going to swing the forces from the Pacific to the Atlantic to fight the Soviets. Holloway said, for a lot of reasons, this is not a good way to do things, because we have responsibilities in the Pacific. The Japanese said, what are you going to save the West, to sacrifice the East to save the West? What about us? We had we still do, 5 treaties of alliance with Pacific powers. And the swing strategy was not going to help them very much. Holloway said, we have to go back to a different approach to a national strategy. And he put together a plan called Sea Plan 2000, which really reinstated a lot of the previous emphases on projection of power ashore and presence, as well as sea control. He said that's important as well, but we need to keep them all in balance. Now, that was not adopted by the Carter administration, but the ideas went forward to what was later called the maritime strategy of the 1980s. And Admiral or Secretary of the Navy John Layman, of course, during the 1980s, and in charge of the 600 ship fleet and the maritime strategy, he basically said the success of the 600 ship Navy owes more to Admiral Holloway than any other individual. He was really key because what he did in the late 70s really helped get us over the hump in the 80s.
Well, right there, that tells you how between the two, Holloway, perhaps less well-known and famous as Zumwalt, actually did more of a long-term shaping of the fleet that would come to be coming out of the 70s. He kind of set the table for what happens in the 80s. And that alone would be to his lasting credit. It's interesting when you read this because their approaches are so very different because they're two very different personalities and individuals, yet they were fast friends through life and they had so many shared experiences. There's so many levels to a comparison like this. It sounds like you think they'd be at loggerheads, but they want the same things, as you repeatedly note in there. They want the same things. It's the how. They're different about the how, not the what. And in the end, it's almost like the tortoise and the hare, is it not? I mean,
they continued to be friends after their retirements.
Yeah.
I mean, they would get together at the Naval Historical Center, then now the Naval History and Heritage Command, and get along famously. I mean, their families were close. They did things socially, but they had different opinions about the globe, the world, the Navy's place in the world, and just a different approach to, and it really related to their personalities, I think. But they both had good hearts. They both tried their best, and they had successes. They had failures, but
and they also were
really a study in contrast.
I'm sorry, what was that?
No, it really is a study in contrast, I think.
Very much so. Yeah. And it's important to remember the backdrop. This is a very challenging period for the Navy. They're facing all sorts of internal strife and infrastructural issues, social things, all that. It was a very tough time. But I always like to wrap things up with a counterfactual just for fun. And your article made me think of it, and you talking about it made me think of it even more. President Carter was not really a good fit with Holloway. They had different approaches to what the Navy should be and how it should be shaped. It almost seems like Zumwalt would have worked better under Carter than Holloway did. What do you think of the idea? If Zumwalt,
well, I think actually that has a lot of merit because when you look at the Carter's worldview, he was very much in support of, escorting troop ships to Europe to support NATO. And on two occasions, he shot down. The Navy put forth plans to build the next generation of aircraft carrier. And Carter vetoed the first proposal. He also vetoed the second, but it was overridden by the Congress. They wanted these ships. And so, Admiral Zumwalt was really very much in tune with it. Now, he comes right at the tail end of the Vietnam War, Admiral Zumwalt, and he said, number one, we have been hammered by sending all these ships to fight in Vietnam. Maintenance has gone into the toilet, if you will, and we are operating with many World War II ships still in Vietnam. A lot of these are becoming rust buckets, and we're not getting new ships in. The budget will not support it. It's going to tanks and planes and the rest. So the physical state of the fleet was not what it should have been. The anti-war and anti-Vietnam feeling in the country was sky high. Congress was wanting away from things military, away from commitment to overseas interventions. So how is the Navy going to get money for the ships that it needs to build up for the Soviet threat? Both Holloway and Zumwalt had to face that. They didn't get all the money they really needed to get. They did as well as they could, but it was not an easy thing to get sailors into the service. That's really one of the reasons why Admiral Zumwalt really made an outreach to women and African Americans. He said, we need everybody. We can't be exclusive anymore. With the end of the draft in January of 1973, we're not going to have a ready pool of people coming in. We have to want them to come in, and we have to keep people in the Navy who are already in and not leave after one tour, their first tour. So neither one of them had really great success in that regard, but they took a shot at it, and they made some strides ahead. So yeah, it was the country itself was a little dark about things military in the 1970s. Turned around, of course, in the 1980s for various reasons. But so they had a tough road to hoe.
They certainly did. One last thing, and it just dawned on me as we're talking. They're different personalities, but very much both serving their nation and their Navy admirably and impressively, really. Were they different politically? What were I guess the politics doesn't affect their duties so much, but it just because of the human side of it. Do they have similar politics, or does that not really factor in?
I've never really Admiral Holloway, I don't think he ever expressed outwardly his religious beliefs. Now, he had gone to a
politically, not religiously. Politically.
Politically. No, I don't recall Admiral Holloway saying, "Oh, I'm a Republican," or Admiral Zumwalt a little different. And I don't think he ever came out and said, I'm an extreme liberal or anything of that sort. But he ran for the Democratic ticket in Virginia after his retirement. He lost that election. So, Democratic. And he clearly had left of center views in terms of his. I mean, you look at his valedictorian address in high school in Tulare, California. The whole theme of his address was a humanitarian thing. We need to help people in the world do the good thing and all that. He carried that through his entire time, his entire life. In fact, after retirement, and that's one of the reasons why he still retains a lot of national knowledge of him. He was very big on the Agent Orange exposure issue. His son died, he and the son believed, from Agent Orange exposure, which Admiral Zumwalt had ordered. Now, the Navy didn't spray Agent Orange, the Air Force did, but still, Admiral Zumwalt ordered it so that his son and the others who were piloting swift boats in the Mekong Delta, where the foliage comes right down to the water, you need to find a way to keep that foliage back from the water, or our guys are at risk. And they both said some of us would have been killed earlier if that foliage hadn't been taken away. But still, it did affect a lot of sailors, and sailors died from Agent Orange exposure. And he was also very big on anti-mining legislation, various other things in retirement, which kept him in the public eye, very much a humanitarian. And he was, as I said, running for the Democratic seat in Virginia. So he's a Democrat. But I don't recall Admiral Holloway saying one way or the other, or seeing even in his oral histories or anything else.
Well, I find that admirable, actually. It's another interesting layer about the two of them.
Right.
Well, Ed, I could talk about this all day with you. This is so fascinating. And I've like a lot of our readers, I've become more and more interested in the 1970s as they go further into the rear view. And you speak with such authority and inside knowledge about this period that it's a joy to talk to you about it. And it makes me want to learn more about this chapter of our Navy's history.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Eric. And I have to say that we have a book that's being worked on it even as we speak with the Naval Institute, and it's on the U.S. Navy and the end of the Vietnam War. And next year will be the 50th anniversary of Operation Frequent Wind, and so me and my fellow co-authors are looking at the events of 1975, but also the impact of the Vietnam War on the out years. So that's coming down the road from Naval Institute.
Oh, I can't wait. Glad to hear about that. Is that next year? Do you know, or
2026 will be out?
Okay. Well, we'll keep our eyes out for that, and I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk about that when it comes out, and hopefully sooner than that too.
Right.
It's always a pleasure, Ed, to have you in the magazine and have you join us on the podcast. So thank you again so much. And I look forward to your next offering in the magazine for more food for thought. Until then, that's it for today, folks. This has been a great discussion, and thank you for joining us for it. Until next time, I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine, and we'll see you again soon.